Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here today, as we generally do, with our large damp square-headed brush. Here I'm applying some primary blue to the top and bottom of our canvas. This will be both for our sky and a reflection of our sky down in the lake as well. Then I'm going to begin blending the blue in towards the center. From there, I'm going to go back to my palette. I'm going to grab a good amount of titanium white. I'm going to apply that to the middle of the canvas, and I'm going to begin to blend it both upwards and downwards into the sky and into the water. This is going to render a smooth gradient of light. It's going to make the painting a little bit more dynamic. It's going to give it a little bit more depth. It's going to ensure that we don't have a flat sky, and it's going to create a bit of a vignette, meaning that the edges of the painting are darker. The eye will innately go to the brightest point of the painting, which is now the bright middle portion, so it'll ensure that the viewer's eye stays where we want it. Now, from there, I'm going to switch over to my old square-headed brush. This is a brush that essentially has the bristles that leaf off in varying directions. You can make your own very simply by peeling back the bristles of a square-headed brush. But essentially, when you make a dabbing motion with this brush, you render a litany of different implications on your canvas. It's a very easy way to do a lot very quickly. It's fantastic for foliage, especially in the distance. So that's what we're doing right there, and I'm starting off with a bit of a purple pigment. It's a mixture of a good amount of primary blue with a little bit of primary red, some titanium white, and I'm starting with that in this fall setting because when orange is very far away in the distance, generally it looks very desaturated, and when orange is very desaturated, it can kind of play this optical illusion where it looks a little bit purple. So we're starting with that in the far distance to create some depth. Then we're going to add this greenish orange on top of it. This was a mixture comprised of primary yellow, primary red, a little bit of titanium white, and it also has the blue on it from the previous applications. So that's how we're getting the green in there as well. The blue is mixing with the yellow, but it's nice because it's in the background and it's kind of subtle. It's a good amalgamation of all of our colors. It'll make it look a lot more interesting. Then I'm taking a little bit of Mars Black. I'm applying this in between our tree line and our reflection in the water. I'm building it up and I'm also moving it downwards. The goal here is to ensure that the base of our trees and our foliage is a little bit darker because they're going to have a lot of shadows cast upon them from the other trees, and really only the tops of the trees are going to have those nice bright highlights. So it's just an easy way of building some depth in your painting. From there, however, I'm going to switch over to my trees in my foreground. I'm going to be using my smaller square-headed brush. I'm using a mixture of Mars Black and Burnt Umber, and I'm using a fairly watery mixture. I'm incorporating a good amount of water because it's going to thin my paint, but it's also going to allow me to make very concise, sharp lines on the canvas. It's going to render something that's very much akin to branches. If we weren't to use any water at all, we'd probably get a bit of a textured, toothy look. We'd really see the canvas through it. So if you're ever working on a subject and you think that it needs to be a little bit more refined, I'd simply implore you to incorporate a little bit more water. It will help you with that application process. However, it will thin your paint to a point so you might have to do a couple of layers. Now, I'm still kind of just working in these branches, and at this point you'll probably recognize the fact that this painting is a little bit familiar. I actually took this composition from a previous painting, one of cherry blossom trees. It was a crowd favorite and I thought we'd bring it back for the fall season, but there will be a link to the original video in the description. With that said, I now have a good base for my trees, and I'm going to begin working on the foliage underneath them. I'm going to begin with a very dark green. This is a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, and Mars Black. And I'm allowed to make it so dark right now because we're just adding in the base layer. We'll be adding in a lot of highlights into it later, but with acrylic paints you generally want to start off with a darker layer, then you add a bit of a mid-tone, then you add a lighter tone. That's how you build depth, and that's really what we're doing right now. I'm also incorporating the reflection down into it as well. Now here I've incorporated some titanium white into my mixture, and I'm adding some highlights to areas that I think will be receiving light. This is very subtle, but it will create a little bit of depth in that process. Then I'm switching back over to the smaller square-headed brush, and I'm going to begin working in the reflections for the trees above. Something I didn't get to mention earlier, but it's important when rendering trees. Remember that they all need to be different. You don't ever want them to be standing straight up, you want them to have a little bit of a lean, and you never want two trees to look the same beside each other. Diversity is key. So from there, I'm going to switch back over to my older square-headed brush, and I'm going to begin applying foliage in the foreground. That's right, this brush does not only work in the background, it can also be fantastic for the foreground. It saves a lot of time and renders just so much detail so effectively. It's a very cathartic process. But here, as you can see, we're starting with a bit of a darker green with a little bit of orange in it as well. I'm using a similar color palette to what we used in the background, but I'm using it in a much darker rendering. So we're building up the base layer yet again. We'll be adding all of our midtones and our highlights to this, but we're just getting something nice to begin with. Then I'm going to take more of a true orange and I'm going to begin applying it to the edges and the outskirts of our foliage here. I'm going to begin blending it back into the middle sections through a series of these dabbing effects, and it's going to create a bit of a textured gradient. Generally, when we think of gradients, we think of a smooth transition, but it's very dependent on the subject itself. Sometimes that transition will be smooth, sometimes it will be much more textured, like what we see here. And this is really just our middle tone. We'll be adding a lot of additional pieces to this, and it's important to recognize that acrylic paints really are a process. You have to do all of this layering. So if you're halfway through your painting and you don't entirely love it, recognize that you're not intended to at that point. Acrylic paintings generally come together in that final 10 to 5% of the rendering of it. So don't get discouraged, keep enjoying it, keep enjoying the process. This is a very cathartic thing to paint. So just make sure that you are having a good time and recognize and have faith that it will come together as you continue to work on it. It's also worth noting that when I'm creating those clusters of foliage, they are also always very different. You want to create them with different sizes and shapes. If you create them all in the same way, if you don't incorporate openings, then it can look a little bit boring and void of detail and realism. But from there, I'm starting to get a good base for my painting. So I'm going to take a real highlight now, and I'm going to begin incorporating that around the edges of our painting. So I'm starting predominantly at the tops of the tree. I'm still doing a bit of that blending, that gradient inwards through that tapping effect. But we're essentially starting with that darker green orange. Then I added in more of a true orange. Now we're adding in a bit of a yellow as well for another additional highlight. You might want to use a mixture of a primary yellow and a titanium white to thicken the yellow, because primary yellow is innately a very thin pigment. It'll blend very much with the initial layer and you might get more of a green. But with the addition of the titanium white, a very thick pigment, you'll get something that stands on its own and really delivers a beautiful, strong yellow. Now, through the implementation of all of the foliage, we kind of lost a lot of the branches, so I'm just going back in and interjecting those as well. I'm kind of weaving them in and out of different applications that we've already incorporated, because I don't want it to look like the branches exist solely behind the tree or solely in front of the tree. They need to be in the tree and then also protruding out through different areas as well. Then I'm going to switch to my medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm going to begin working in some water down below. I'm separating the land from the lake area here, and I'm incorporating all of these horizontal strokes. They're much more dominant in the foreground, they're much more noticeable, and then as we get towards the background, it gets more subtle. It's a very easy way to create depth. Generally, you want the foreground to have a much higher contrast. You want the background to be much more subtle and subdued, because you want the attention and the viewer's eye on the foreground. It's also going to happen because the background is much more an amalgamation of the colors and tones of the sky and everything around it. It isn't simply the innate colors of the specific subject. Now here I'm doing a little bit of detail work around where the branch meets the water. It's a little detail, but it can add a lot to the painting. However, as you can see, I didn't add the reflection of it, so I'm going back and I'm doing that right now. But as per usual with these paintings, the goal is 10 minutes. Sometimes I make it, sometimes I don't. I had a couple of different ideas to continue to add to this, and I wanted to share them with you. So we did take an extra minute and a half. I thought I'd show you what we did, but essentially we started by adding some additional highlights to the trees. Then I kind of desaturated the background with more of a mixture with a bit of a titanium white, just to push it farther away. Then I added in some additional smaller branches to really render some beautiful detail in the foreground as well. But we really just did more of the same, and it ended up rendering something quite beautiful. With that said, that is essentially our 10 to 11-ish minute painting. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like hour-long lessons just like this, there is a link in the description to my Patreon where I also show you my color palettes and when I'm mixing with water. If you'd simply like to learn more about acrylic painting, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. And as always, I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and above all, as always, stay creative.